Welcome to Law Talk Today, a series devoted to bringing you informative and educational programs focused on issues of law, government, and community.
Good evening and welcome to Law Talk Today. My name is Mark Gruber. On this show each week, we interview somebody interesting. We talk about some interesting legal issues, and you get to find out all of the things that go on in and about the law. On tonight's show, I have a very, very interesting guest, someone who is probably not accustomed to being interviewed because she typically is the interviewer. Her name is Peggy Wright. She is the, I guess the legal, I won't say correspondent, but the reporter for Morris County Courthouse. Peg, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Your official title is what?
Reporter.
Reporter.
For the Daily Record newspaper.
Okay. You know, how did you ever get into the, a legal reporter in northern New Jersey? How'd that happen?
I had started out at a totally different paper, the New Jersey Herald, and I was there for 5 years full-time, a few years part-time. And then I was getting a little restless. I had loved my editor, but he went on to another paper. So I was feeling like I wanted to change also. And in 1990, right when I was feeling restless at the New Jersey Herald, I out of the blue got a phone call from the Daily Record. I had a friend who was a reporter at the Daily Record. They had an opening. She recommended me. I was hired in 1990, and I started out as a municipal reporter. But then in 1993,
Okay.
I was doing municipal reporting for a few years. In 1993, there was a double homicide.
In Morris County?
In Morris County. And I wound up being asked, various reporters did different stories about this double homicide, but I wound up doing a pretty extensive profile of the killer, and I guess my bosses thought I did a good job on it. The person who covered the Morris County Courthouse decided to move on to another paper, so they offered me. And they offered me the courthouse beat, kind of on the basis of writing this profile of this killer. And somewhat bizarrely, I also, when I first started at the Daily Record, for the first few years, I often worked weekends, and virtually every weekend, actually about once a month, there was a homicide or some major criminal event. And so that's how I really got introduced.
Okay.
Through my weekend shifts. And things worked out pretty well. And so when an opening came up, I was asked if I would like the courthouse beat.
Now, I presume you have a background in journalism of some sort, right? Writing or English or?
I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in writing.
Writing.
And that's from Vermont. And we took just a few journalism courses. A lot of it was just expository writing, just how to be a better writer.
How do you go about writing about the cases that go on in the Morris County Courthouse? How do you wander around the halls and the courtrooms looking for a good scoop?
I do. I do. I feel very. I get a lot of adrenaline going when I hear something interesting, and it's because I've covered the courthouse for a long period of time now. I feel like I'm pretty attuned to what's going on. There's a lot of lists I can refer to. It's a very large courthouse in Morris County. I forget the exact number of courtrooms, but there's roughly 20 courtrooms,
Okay.
I believe. And most of the chambers produces calendars, and I keep a lot of lists of what's coming up.
You can go into a judge's chambers and ask the assignment clerk or the secretary, what's going on here today, and then you say, well, that could be an interesting story. I'll cover it.
And a lot of
Yeah.
right. I have a good relationship, and the Morris County Courthouse tends to be very open. I've been there so long. I have I think a good relationship with a lot of the judges. I feel like there's a phenomenal complement of judges in the Morris County Courthouse, and so I feel very comfortable.
I imagine the lawyers too. I mean, when I'm in the courthouse in Morris, I invariably run into you.
Yeah, I'm always
walking around the hallway, and I say, Peg, how are you? What's new? And you go, Mark, you tell me what's new. You're looking for a story, right, of some kind or another.
I often, I do. I frequently, whenever I see somebody, what are you here for? Anything interesting? And there's, in many unexpected areas, there's something interesting. And one thing I do very faithfully is there's a criminal intake unit, and that's where all the criminal complaints come in of people who have been arrested in the last 48 hours. So I religiously look at them, and that yields some really great information, because I can often find out from the complaints that come in, I can often find out about an interesting arrest before the police are even really ready to tell us. Right. I don't cover municipalities anymore. Mm-hmm. I certainly do help out with it, and when I need to, I will often call police in Morris and sometimes Sussex. But I kind of get a heads up just by seeing the complaints come in.
So there's a never-ending cases that come through the courthouse of all different types. How do you determine which ones you're going to write about? Is it a combination where you have to write, the basics about some of the, the more notoriable cases, or do you look for that human interest, interesting story, or both?
Well, obviously I follow if there's been a major incident, a homicide, mm-hmm. a vehicular homicide, a fatal fire. Fatal fires aren't necessarily, the police and the prosecutor's office will go to fatal fires just to see if it was arson. But more often those are accidental. But I will, a lot of things happen obviously outside the courthouse. A murder, sometimes we've had kidnappings, thefts, they'll happen. And then when I learn of them, either through the police or seeing criminal complaints, and the prosecutors often gives us heads up, I will keep lists, put it in my calendar, keep track of those events, what's coming up in them, because usually if somebody's arrested, they'll have a first appearance. A date will be set for them to come back to court. So I just log all these things in a calendar. But those are aside from those events, I would say a lot of the bulk of what I do is just kind of going to all the different courtrooms and asking people what's going on. And sometimes I see the craziest things that don't seem, they're not really major, but they're the kinds of things that just about anybody could find themselves caught up in. For example, a couple months ago, I came across a woman who, she was in court, and there was a prosecutor there, and there's a particular prosecutor who handles a lot of white-collar crime and police corruption crime. So I always make a beeline for him when I see him in court. And so one day I just happened to ask him, "What are you doing today?" And he said, "Oh, I do have an interesting one. It's a woman who, she was charged with theft from her employer. She claimed that she was on jury duty when she really wasn't." And so I wrote about that, and that got a tremendous response because it was just a little mundane, but so quirky. It was the kind of thing that...
Like a human interest.
Yeah.
It's like,
A little low level.
Don't try that yourself.
Right.
Or you'll get caught.
And then I just came across something about 2 weeks ago where a man is charged with, and I guess it's sort of just instinct. You know, what strikes me as, whoa, that is really interesting or strange. I feel like I have a little bit of an instinct that for sort of zany things, but there was something just a few weeks ago where a man was having he's been having a long-running dispute with his neighbor, and it's really a civil thing over they're having a dispute over their property line. And one day, one of the property owners was so annoyed, he called the police. The police weren't giving him satisfaction. And however it occurred, he somehow had taken a photograph of the responding police officer sleeping on the job. I don't know how that transpired, but now this property owner, he's accused of saying to the policeman, unless you satisfy my property complaint, I'm going to show your superiors I've got this picture of you. He's charged with criminal coercion.
Wow.
You know, essentially trying to extort the cop. So that was just a very simple complaint I happened to see.
Yeah, what is it that you can and cannot do? Are there constraints on what you can write about?
I cannot write about adoptions.
Okay.
The court has begun to have, I think it's a national event, an adoption day, where the family court holds a big celebration like a party, but for parents who have adopted children. And I attend that, but I cannot literally, those are closed hearings. But other than that,
juvenile hearings are closed to the public.
I just went to a juvenile hearing today.
Yeah, but generally they're closed to the general public.
Juvenile hearings are, but they can be open under a judge's discretion.
Okay.
And in Morris, thankfully, when I started at the Daily Record, we had Judge Ed Gannon. In Morris, he was the juvenile judge, and he had so many programs going for juveniles that he wanted some exposure of the programs. Plus, Morris County was beginning to see an increase in violent crime among juveniles. So he felt that he wanted the public to know that, look, the kids are getting worse, and but I also want the public to see what we're doing to help juveniles. So he invited, this is really 20 years ago, Judge Gannon invited the press in. We cannot use the kids' names, can't give identifiers.
Right.
You know, I can't say, oh, the boy with a stud in his tooth.
Or the captain of the football team. Something.
Exactly.
Right.
We can't give identifiers like that. But one really interesting thing about juvenile court, but we can write about what they did. And today I happened to go to, it's gotten a lot of publicity. There was a young boy in the county who committed suicide in March. And it was, the circumstances surrounding his suicide were bullying. And it turned out there are 2 juveniles charged with robbing him, this boy who committed suicide. They were both in juvenile court today. They were kind of, it's a really pretty tragic case, but it's currently ongoing. So there was a juvenile case that occurred today.
How about First Amendment type stuff? I mean, is there certain things that that, you know, you're permitted, that you can or cannot do in terms of constitutional rights? You know, you go to an evidentiary hearing and, you know, maybe evidence gets excluded. Can you print that stuff?
Yes.
Okay. How about political? Are you, maybe the editors of your paper don't want you to get too political, or not, I don't know. But are those considerations that you have to take?
No, not really. I think sort of the essence of the paper I work for is I think they're very fair. They cautious. You don't you don't want to needlessly embarrass people. That's a big thing to me as a reporter. I come across an enormous amount of information. For example, that maybe a defendant has AIDS, or that a defendant is in the middle of a sex change operation.
Right.
And if it's relevant to the story, I might put it in, but not gratuitously.
Okay.
And sometimes even I might put something in, and my bosses will say, you know, you might want to take that out.
Right.
Because you have to sort of think of how some readers get offended at seeing that anyway. They'll be like, what does that have to do with the story? But you also try to think of how the person being written about is going to react to personal information.
Now, how about writing stories about ongoing cases where there are juries? And you don't want to report those so a juror can read it in the paper, and
I write it.
You have no problem doing that.
There actually, sometimes I have a problem. There have been, yes, sometimes I do have a problem with that, but I kind of take it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
I can't think of a good example right at the moment.
Well,
but
let me give you an example. You're writing a story about a jury trial that's ongoing, whether it's criminal or
right.
civil, doesn't matter. And you know that the jurors are going to go in and they'll deliberate, and you don't want to influence them by what you've written, okay?
Right.
Because that could lead to a mistrial.
Right, but they've sworn that they will not read newspapers.
Okay.
So the juries are all incredibly cautioned. Don't visit the site. Don't read anything if somebody talks to you about it. But
and stay off of your computer and your cell phone.
Right. They're given all these cautions, but I don't know how realistic that is. Maybe somehow they see or hear something. There have been circumstances where I have felt that something I may write, some knowledge I had of a person on trial would be really prejudicial. So I've withheld it until the verdict.
Okay. Now, when you're doing a story, this is the question I've been wanting to ask you. You do a story, and you read whatever papers may be in the court files that are open to the public.
Right.
Right. And you listen to the testimony sometimes that's going on in the courtroom, right?
Right.
Do you do an investigation outside of those two things? Do you interview people that are involved in the case and make that part of your story? Or
I do try to.
Okay.
I do try to. It's a lot easier when the case first begins, because it's easier to interview people connected to a case when the case is right at the start.
Mm-hmm.
Because after a while, once it gets into where it's approaching a trial, sometimes they get a lot more, people get a lot more unwilling to talk. They're a little afraid. I think they don't know their own parameters. Will the prosecutors get angry at them? Mm-hmm. Will they somehow screw up the case? Really, in this context, I'm speaking probably of victims, where sometimes family members of a murdered person, they may talk initially because the emotion is so high, but then sometimes as the case gets rolling, they'll be more silent because they don't want to screw up anything
Okay.
for the prosecution.
Do you ever interview the jurors?
Yes.
Okay, and there's no prohibition against that here in New Jersey, is there?
No.
Unless, I guess a judge could say to the jurors, I don't want you talking to anybody under the most bizarre facts I can imagine. But what do you ask them?
I ask them, for the most part, jurors are kind of reluctant, and I think it's because they're given a very heavy-duty warning.
Right.
You know, anything you repeat, you know, you should be willing to repeat in open court. Anything you may tell a member of the media, you should be willing to repeat in open court. But sometimes, when a case has been, actually it's easier to get jurors to talk in an acquittal, because sometimes they're kind of annoyed that the prosecutors brought this case.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes they're a little angry that somebody was actually put on trial for something they may not agree, that they didn't agree was a crime.
Right.
And so actually in some of those cases, they're more willing to talk. In others, sometimes they're very emotional after finding like a person guilty of a murder. And sexual assaults, they're very wary. Sometimes it can lead to problems too. We did have a sex case. It was a really interesting, it was just a very quirky sex case. It was a man who, he was a volunteer for juveniles, and he was at a YMCA, and he played what they call the shower game with a young boy, where this volunteer adult man, he directed a shower spray onto the little boy and told the boy to open up his swimming trunks. So it was sexual in nature. The little boy told his mother. The mother went to the police. There was a whole trial on this, the shower game man. The jury had a very hard time with that, but that created kind of a very prickly situation. Mm. They found him guilty, but then I was talking to some jurors, and the Star Ledger, my rival, we get along great.
I bet.
But we were interviewing some jurors, and they didn't realize that the man had been found guilty of a second-degree crime, which meant a presumption he would go to prison. Right. They were aghast. Yeah, some of the jurors, they thought, we just want to teach him a lesson. We thought this would be, he'd get probation. And they some of these jurors wound up writing letters to the judge. And it created a bit of a bit of a problem.
Hmm. Now, you, Peg, you probably see and hear and know more legal cases than anybody around. More than one judge, more than one lawyer, because you're like snooping around, cataloging all these things so you can write your stories. In your years, what's one of the most interesting cases that you've reported?
I have a couple, and I'll keep it real brief. I'm not I'm not sure I'm so great on the legal end, right, because some of the law can be very technical.
Right.
I do try to watch the charges sometimes because they are interesting, but they get very technical. And I think I'm a little better just on more writing the human aspect of what's occurring.
Okay.
Because that's probably what more the general public would relate to.
It's a better read. Details
of a case. It gets,
sure.
And since I'm not a lawyer, I don't always know if I try to explain the law. I don't. I have to be worried if I'm saying it accurately.
Sure.
Because but a couple cases, one of them was just fascinating to me, was an elderly, it was handled by the chancery judge, but there was an elderly woman, she was in her 80s, and she lived in Jefferson. She was a widow, no children. She came out in her yard one day. There was the handsomest young man out there. He was in his early 20s. He was picking apples in her backyard. She was very, very caustic, this woman. I met her in court but very sharp-tongued, really mentally sharp. But she sees this stranger, this incredibly handsome stranger in her yard, and they get to talking. He's just taking her apples. They get to talking. Before you know it, he's moved into her life. It turned out she was very wealthy. He found out she had no children. He kind of moved in on her. And there wound up being a trial because eventually she tried to adopt him. He was completely exploiting her. He moved into a little bungalow she had on her property. She was giving him gifts. And he was like the best dressed man you could ever see. And one day she found out. Eventually he was forging her name. He eventually got her stock portfolio put into his name. And she went into, I'm not sure how this works, but she went into her safety deposit box one day and went to get her turnpike bonds, because that's what she used to pay her taxes, and they were gone. She called a lawyer, and so it was immediately a theft trial. And I covered it. It was really interesting. And she was in court every day. She'd always wear dark sunglasses in court. And the guy would come in. He was so exquisitely dressed, and he had alligator boots. And she'd see him walk in, and she'd go, "There's the boots, I bought him." And she'd comment about like what he was wearing. But it wound up, it was just, what were gifts and what did he steal from her? Because she did, right. Some of what he got were gifts. It was a very interesting.
What was the verdict?
It turned out the judge decided that certain things were gifts.
And weren't.
She bought him a motorcycle, all these things. She wanted everything back when she found out he had taken her turnpike bonds, but she got the majority of it back, but he got quite a bit too, cash. It went on for a long time. It was fascinating because of the characters.
One more quick story, because we're running out of time.
Oh, okay.
I told you this would go fast. One of your other favorite stories over the years that you've reported.
One thing I found extremely poignant was a woman who, and this is actually an issue that is current in another county right now. I forget which county, but there was a woman who, she was married to a man who found out he was dying. She wanted to have his children. So his semen was taken, his sperm was taken. After he died, she was artificially inseminated. She gave birth to twins. Then she tried to get Social Security benefits because the children, their father was deceased. She could not get Social Security benefits because she gave birth something like 18 months after her husband's death. It was that reproductive methods were not keeping pace
with the Social Security laws.
Right. And with beneficiary laws. And so it's actually, she kind of got, to my knowledge, she got no satisfaction. It was just a very interesting issue but it's arisen again in another county right now. The same sort of, because you're supposed to be eligible for Social Security benefits, you have to have given birth in 9 months.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Peg, we are kind of out of time, and I wanted to ask you this though before you leave us, okay? How do you like being the courthouse reporter? On a personal level.
I enjoy it immensely because it gives me a lot of satisfaction. After all these years, I guess it's about 18 years being in the courthouse, I still feel a lot of adrenaline for an interesting story. I feel like a real rush to get a good story.
Yeah.
And I maybe it's old-fashioned, but I feel like reporters are meant to get scoops. Mm-hmm. So I do like scooping other media. There's fantastic reporters, and some are tremendously better than me at getting people to talk. But I feel like I'm pretty good at getting some good scoops around the courthouse.
Well, good for you. Sounds like a very satisfying career. And
It is.
well, keep it up. Thanks for being a guest on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. It did go fast.
How do you like being interviewed in the role reversal here, huh? Interesting.
Yeah, I like to talk, I guess.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Law Talk today. I'm Mark Gruber. Please join us next week, and good night.